Thank you, everyone, for joining my session. My presentation is called Keeping a Cool Head in the Eye of the Storm. It's about my experiences with incident response and some kind of practical talk about incident response leadership and why incident response is cool, frankly. Just want to say thanks for attending my talk. I know Dave Kennedy's also presenting at the same time, so I got that good luck, but it's also very cool to be able to talk where he's talking to. So very excited to talk about this. I hope everyone enjoys. So let's start off with who am I? Why am I giving this presentation? My name is Benjamin Spencer. I am the SOC director for TrueSec currently. Before that, I was a senior consultant and incident responder at TrueSec. And I was also a security engineer and incident response for a company called CSG. I've got about 4 years of IR experience at this point, 2 of those in kind of a lead position, which is crazy to me. And I also am a cat owner, as you can see on that picture. I'd like to note that they will almost certainly make an appearance during this presentation because they don't know how to leave me alone. So it's kind of like a hidden Mickey at Disney World. If you see them, good. I'm happy that they can make a presentation when I'm also making a presentation. So let's talk about why VetSecCon. Why am I giving this presentation here? Why do I think it's important for the veterans community to really hear about incident response and what incident response looks like? And there's 2 reasons. The first one's going to be because of what I've heard about from veterans who have got out of the military. I'm not a veteran myself, but I have a lot of friends and I've worked with a lot of veterans. I'm in Omaha, Nebraska, which, as some of you might know, is a massive Air Force community. And a lot of the people who've gotten to cybersecurity in Omaha come from the Air Force. So incident response, I think, is a really good fit for a lot of veterans. And there's a couple of reasons. The first one is, one of the things I hear most from veterans that have come out of the military and who are transitioning out is that they kind of feel like they've lost the meaning of their work. Not to say that the military is always 100% meaningful for every job. Some people don't feel like that is. But a lot of people talk about how difficult it is coming into the civilian workforce. And it's just like their job is to make money for a company or to help a company make money. From my standpoint, incident response is probably one of the few jobs out there that I felt like had a meaning right when I was doing it. I knew that I was coming in on a company's worst day or on a person's worst day, some IT administrator or some network administrator or some CISO. I knew it was their worst day. Something bad had happened. People who were doing these bad things were not good people. So I was able to go in and basically make their days worse. And I was helping people out who really were just kind of innocent people. It's, I think, a very unique job. Not a lot of people get to say, hey, I'm helping out a multi-million-dollar company or $1 billion company out of a really big hole that was forced upon them by, say, a Russian APT group. So that's one of the first things, is that you get some meaning from this work. And I think it's important to talk about incident response. The other aspect of this is that a lot of veterans say, hey, I miss the close team that I had in the military. I was really close with a lot of people that I worked with, and when I come out, I get into the corporate world where it's a little bit, maybe not fake, but it's very much a surface level kind of relationship with people. You don't really know if anyone likes you or if they're just being polite. You don't really know if they're going to back you up, and a lot of times they won't. An instant response is different in the sense that you are working a really high stress job, working to do something that a lot of people feel really matters, and it becomes very personal very quickly. You make really strong relationships with the people that you work this job with, and it becomes really a team environment. It's still going to be a corporate America environment. It's never going to be the same as what you had, but it's closer than going in and becoming a pen tester a lot of times, or going in and becoming a SOC analyst. You get a different environment, and because of how high-paced it is and how stressful and how important the job is to a lot of people, you really get to share some really strong relationships with people, and they will back you up. And that is 2 reasons from, I guess, my first reason here of why am I presenting this at VetSecCon. The other reason is I think incident response is it's not talked a lot about. And it's a very good option for veterans who want to go into cybersecurity. Everyone knows about pen testing. People know about threat intelligence. That's talked a lot about in the military cyber community. People know about SOC analyst jobs. They know about a lot of these things, but the incident response and forensics path is not as popular. one, it's harder to make TV shows about. No one wants to make a TV show about me looking at logs for 10 hours a day. But two, it's also just, it's not seen as cool. So I think it's a really good, it's a really good career pathway for someone who is transitioning out of the military or who's just gotten into cybersecurity and says, hey, this is what I want my goal to be. So I would encourage you to take a look, listen to my presentation and say, hey, does this sound like a job that I would want to do? Like I said, I'm going to talk a lot about what bad incident response is and what good incident response looks like. I also hope that anyone who does become an incident responder thinks about my presentation and potentially is able to say, hey, this is what we can do to change this to make it more like what I've heard in the past. Because on the other aspect of incident response being a really great job for people, there's a lot of bad incident response teams. And part of why I do this talk is so that I can try to help improve them across the industry, because I think it's important. And I think it's such a small niche community that we have to help each other. So with that spiel out of the way, let's talk about incident response in general. Let's actually get to the meat of the talk. What is incident response? Let's go over it. When I do incident response, what my job is to go in and find out what exactly happened from a forensic standpoint of an attacker getting into a system or a network or a company, finding out how that happened, restoring a environment to either the same, which is a bad idea, or to a better situation so that that attacker can't get in, and then basically being able to say, hey, this attacker is no longer in the environment. This happens in phases. When I do incident response, there are direct phases. Mind you, they're on the screen here, but mind you, while there is a bunch of distinct phases, and we can talk about this from an academic level, what I will tell you from experience is that incident response feeds into each other. You're not going to be doing preparation and detection on a distinct phase. It's all part of the same aspect. When I'm doing forensics, the recovery people are coming to me and saying, hey, can I say this system is safe? If not, what do I need to look for from a persistent standpoint? Have you seen anything going on with this system? It's all happening as I'm doing forensics, and recovery is happening in parallel. And that's to help companies get back up quicker and to do this in a faster manner. When we talk about these phases, these are very academic. I want to be very clear here. It's very true that it happens in phases, but with each incident, one of the cool parts about the job, and why I also think it's a good fit for a lot of people who come out of the military, is that each incident is different. You're learning something on a day-to-day basis when you do incident response. The tactics might be the same, a lot of times not. The tools might be the same, but when you do incident response, each environment is going to be different. How the incident happened is going to be different. And so when we talk about these phases, they can mean the same thing across all these incidents, but everything during that incident can be different. The only real change, I will say, though, is scope. You're still doing the same sort of forensics. You're still doing the same sort of recovery. Scope and how these happen is really the only things that have changed during that incident response engagement. So it's just important to note that you're going to get to do different things. It does not become very samey, but once you've done a few incidents, you know how to do incident response across many environments. Basically, to sum this all up, your job is to work through the attacker's kill chain when we talk about incident response. And that, once again, is far more abstract than what the day-to-day is, but I really do want to make sure that everyone knows that it is not something where you're going to continually feel like you're drowning. Your first ones will, but then after the first one or two, you're going to start saying, okay, I know how this process goes. And that process is actually really important. So when we talk about incident response, I talk about IR leadership, because that's really the thing that I think is probably the most important aspect. You can have really great technical people on an incident response team. You can have some of the best incident response team members out there. But the thing that makes a good incident response team versus a bad incident response team in a lot of cases is the incident response leadership. Incident response isn't hard, guys. In a lot of ways, it's very easy technically. I'm not having to solve incredibly technically challenging things, mostly because it's all right there sometimes. But I'm not having to go out there and create something. It's very easy to just go in there and to look at things. It just takes a while, and it can be very complex. It's not hard, however, and I want to make sure that's clear. So you don't have to be the super technical wizard to do incident response, but it's one of those things that is, going to take a while, and it requires discipline and persistence. So to kind of talk about what incident response leadership is and why it's so important, I'm going to give you guys a scenario. The scenario is, in the middle of the night, 2 a.m., your phone goes off. You have your boss calling you, telling you, hey, get into the office. someone called in and said that their printer server screen says that they can't print because they've been locked because of Goop key ransomware or something. I have no idea. So you get called in and you're told, come into the office. All right, I'm coming into the office. I drive. It's about a 15-minute drive. It's a Friday, mind you. It's always a Friday. And so I'm very tired, and I get into the office. My entire team's there, and my boss is in their office talking to some people. We're kind of milling around. It takes about 15 minutes to mill around, talk with each other. You remote into a couple servers, see this ransom note saying that all your files have been encrypted and stuff's been stolen, and you're going to have to pay us some Bitcoin. That's how these scenarios start. Mind you, when I'm talking about the scenario, this is going to be a real scenario here. I've changed a couple things, but this is a real scenario. This directly comes with an interview of what I've done with one of the incident responders for an internal company. So, whole team's in the office now. They've milled around for about 15 minutes. I'm sitting there verifying this is an incident. Boss comes out and says, "Hey, everyone, you're going to be here for quite some time. It's going to be 24/7. No one's leaving the office until we get fixed. The entire company's ransomware. All the satellite offices are down. We're at a standstill. We need to figure out what happened." And that is your directive, is you're told, find out what happened. Let's get to work. So you get to work. You start finding out what happened. Now, in your mind, what happened can mean a lot of different things. But for you jump onto the EDR system and you start taking a look at some of the servers, start going in there. That's what you think is going to make most sense. Another one of the people, your network administrator, says, "Hey, I'm going to go look at the network logs. I know how to find attackers in the network logs, so I'm going to go do that." Great, fantastic. You guys are all just kind of deciding what you want to do, and you start investigating. Mind you, this is 2:00 in the morning, so you're all tired, but you've got some coffee and you're going to keep working. About 4 hours go by. Finally, people are starting to trickle in that are upper leadership. And your boss comes out of their office, because the boss has been holed up in their office this entire time talking with people, and lets you know, "Hey, we need you to find out if any data has been exfiltrated. Legal wants to know this." So you are currently finding, how the ransomware was deployed and the PowerShell scripts that were used, all these cool technical things. But legal wants to know if anything was exfiltrated. Well, the statement that, they have exfiltrated data from the note is your first clue that stuff has been, but you need to know exactly what is. So you start looking around. You don't really have any tooling in place to find out if data is exfiltrated. You don't really know what that looks like. You don't really know what you're searching for. So it takes a few hours. It's about 3 hours. Your boss comes back, asks you about it. You basically rabble off a list of things that you think has been exfiltrated potentially. Cool, great. You've done that. Your boss really doesn't seem to be very pleased with it. He says, "Okay, well, that's great, but I need to know if any employee data had been touched." So you've just spent 3 hours doing this. Now you've gotten barely any feedback, and it's now, "Hey, I'm going to go look to see if any employee data was touched," because HR is concerned about legal liability there. So you go do that. You go look out for legal liability. It is now noon at this point once you find out if any employee data has been touched, and you definitely think there has been. Mind you, you're no closer to getting anything figured out from a forensic standpoint. You don't know how this has happened, or if the attacker's still there, or what's going on. And your boss comes back and says, "Hey, we need to know if any customer data has been touched." This is now 12:00. You've been tasked with basically 3 different things over 10 hours. You're starting to get pretty tired because you basically pulled an all-nighter. And it's Saturday, and you're really upset, and people are calling you from home. So this goes on for quite some time. This goes on for about 5 days until that Tuesday. You've been working there. You're sleeping at the office. You're getting pizza brought in. You're eating pizza just about every meal, by the way, and you're really tired of that pizza. And on that 5th day, you're told that the systems administrator team and the network team has been able to stand up a production environment, and things are okay. Let's wrap up the incident because we got to go back to operations. You've not discovered how any of this stuff happens forensically. You don't know what's going on, but you're so tired that you say, "Okay, cool." So you kind of go back to just doing what you normally do, which is insane to you and to a lot of other people, but you do. And then Friday night rolls around again. You're still pretty tired, and you get a phone call in the middle of the night, and it says, "Hey, you need to come into the office. Your system's been ransomed. Our system's been ransomed again. We got to come back in and do some incident response." What just happened? You just were part of a failed incident response. To note, when that happened, when that second incident response scenario was declared, My team was called in to help them out. What I will tell you is that everything that just happened there was not a result of the incident responder itself. It was not the person who'd just been called in by their boss in the middle of the night. What happened there, that failure, was a direct result of poor IR leadership. I'm going to stress again that technically incident response is not difficult. It is, however, time consuming, and it does require you to know what to do. And it also is very, very stressful, both from an individual level and from an organizational standpoint. When you have lots of stress, you have poor judgment and decision making. It makes everything that much harder. If you are going to have stress basically placed upon the decision, you are going to have a very difficult time making any decision and going forward with it. Everything that happens during an incident response creates stress. You being at the office for a long time, you having to do stuff outside of what you normally would do from a day-to-day standpoint. The fact that you're having to eat crappy pizza instead of what you would make at home creates stress for you. The important thing to note is during incident response, all of this stress lengthens your OODA loop. And we'll talk about the OODA loop because it's actually the most important thing of incident response and why IR leadership is so important. So the OODA loop, most of you probably know what this is. This is your basic decision-making process that you go through for every single conscious decision that you make. You observe, orient, decide, and act for every decision or every stimuli that you react to, essentially. During an emergency situation, this OODA loop, every step of this decision-making process gets lengthened. Proper IR leadership is the key to shortening the OODA loop. If you do not have good leadership in an incident response, it's going to take your team so much time to decide what to do and how to do things that you're just going to sit there and spin your wheels, which is what happened in this scenario. Is that team spent about 5 days just sitting there, spinning their wheels, getting nothing done. And by the end of it, nothing had actually happened. And they were right back where they started by that Friday because the attacker was there. It's really important to understand this. Mind you, this is not a new concept. Everyone knows that stress is really bad for decision-making and it makes incident response really hard. So back in 2000s or even before the 2000s, we kind of came out with something called disaster recovery. This was meant for what we see here, a fiber optic cable seeking backhoe, which says, hey, we're going to knock out your internet. We're going to knock out your connections to your sites. We're going to knock out your VPN. You've created a disaster recovery plan, which is basically a step-by-step process for how you bring your company back up if a certain thing has happened. This is not good for incident response. This is why incident response, and a lot of times internally, will lead to disasters because companies try to follow their disaster recovery plan instead of their incident response plan, or they don't have an incident response plan. So when we talk about incident response, understand it's not disaster recovery. And the main differentiator is the fact that you have an adversary during incident response. You cannot follow this disaster recovery plan on a step-to-step basis because a lot of time the attacker knows that you have a disaster recovery plan and they're going to do things to make your life harder. They're going to make it so that you can't get into your domain name accounts. They're going to make it so that your backups are encrypted or have been totally taken offline and you cannot access them for days on end. The other thing is because you know that there's an enemy there, your OODA loop is going to be much higher because you're thinking, okay, what is the other people doing during this? What is the adversary who's in my systems doing? Why are they, what are they going to do next to make my life harder? And it can be things like leaking your internal incident response chat logs online, to doing things like leaking certain emails that would be very bad to have seen publicly during your incident response situation, which makes your corporate leadership very, very concerned. So understand that during incident response, your OODA loop, just because you know all about the OODA loop, you know all of this stuff here, this is all evident, it does not mean that it's going to be any easier. You can't just plan for this incident response. And that's why IR leadership is so important. Your IR leadership is going to be the ones that are going to react to this sort of basically adversary action, and it's going to be able to switch gears and be able to effectively lead you through these obstacles that they throw up. With that said, I have another slide here specifically because it is inherently adversarial. It's very important to understand this. When you have an adversary out there during incident response, a lot of people assume it's just some dude in their basement that doesn't really care. They're just doing this for lulz. That's not how this works. Anyone who comes from the veteran community knows that you have an enemy a lot of times. You have something that you're preparing for. And it can be everything from your admin people to actual nation state enemies. Incident response is very much like that. When you're talking about your ODA loop and how your adversaries impact it, you have to understand that the adversary wants something from you, and they are likely better funded. They have more time, and they already have set the tempo. So IR, despite how much you practice for it, despite your disaster recovery plan, is going to be inherently reactive, and that's why you need good IR leadership. Your job as a leader is to narrow the operational gap that you've basically been placed into. You don't have the unlimited funding. You don't have the time. You are playing behind the 8 ball because the enemy is already through several chains of that attack kill chain, and you have to play catch up on them before they've either done the ransom or they're sitting there waiting to drop the other shoe, release the data, lock you out of your accounts, release your chat logs. You have a lot of issues there as an IR leader. And your job is to basically make those issues go away for your people. Make it so that when they're making decisions, they have an exact plan of what they're going to do next. They know, okay, I have to do X to get Y. I have to use this to do this. And I also know that I'm not going to be dying because I'm going to be spending 7 days at the office. Your job as a leader is to make it so that your people are going to be able to effectively beat these people who have more money and more time and probably have spent more time doing hacking than your people have done doing incident response. And that's why they have things like Lamborghinis, and they're wanted by the FBI. And your team is a team that's either internal or has been working there and is being called in the middle of the night. Not to say that incident response teams are not great people. They just chose the side of this world that does not pay as well as being a ransomware operator does. So now that we know this, now that we know that your ODA loop is the most important thing during incident response, and that incident response is different from disaster recovery because you have an adversary that wants to do harm to you and wants to make money off of you, let's talk about what unsuccessful IR leadership is and what actually the issues were with that first scenario and why it ended up the way it did. So the first one's going to be that poor communication aspect. Your boss in that scenario there was in their office their entire time talking to people, but not the actual IR team. And you had no way to pass any information except for when they came out and asked you for it. There was nothing there. You just gave them a list, and it didn't really help them. Poor communication lengthens that ODA loop because the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. If corporate wants something from you and you're an incident responder and you don't know how to communicate with corporate, they're going to be confused, you're going to be confused, and it's going to lead to a lot of strife and a lot of longer decision-making processes there. You're not going to be able to make a informed decision around, okay, what do I need to do next? So that's the first one. It's one of the most important ones, but it is not, in fact, the most important one. We'll get to that. Next one is not knowing what you want to do during an IR engagement. This is really bad. This is really, really hard to do as well. It's one of those things that I see time and time again. Some of the places have invested huge amounts of time into their incident response preparedness. And when I come in as an incident responder, the first thing I notice is that they've been all over the place. Despite having this great incident response plan, they don't really know what they're trying to do or get out of their incident response engagement when they're having to react to these things. I can't tell you the times that I've had like 20 Excel sheets thrown at me that are network indicators and IOCs, and these were the C2s that we found, and then these were the systems that we brought back up, but were somehow still ransomed, and it just is a jumbled mess, and no one knows what's going on. And you talk to the IT people who it's their worst day of their life, and they say, yeah, this has been really hard. And it's not their fault. They're doing their best. They're just being sent 40 different ways, and no one knows what they're wanting to get out of the incident response engagement. So if you don't have any focus or direction, you're just going to get this jumbled mess. The next one, which goes honestly hand in hand with the first two, is burning out your incident responders. This is a big one, and I see it from actual incident response teams as well. You'll have people working 20-hour days, and by about hour 16, they're completely worthless. They have I talked to a friend who was doing one of these long engagements, and it was hour 20, and I was like, hey, what's been going on? They say, I don't know. I don't know what's happened the past day. Incident response, like I said, is not hard, but it is exhausting, as Jake says in the chat. It is completely exhausting because your mental faculties are so engaged and it's such a high stress situation that you are literally sitting there for hours on end, looking through logs, trying to find out what happened. And by hour 16 or hour 12 for a lot of people, you just don't know where you're at. You have no situational awareness in any direction you give that's been given to you. It's going to just not function. You're just not going to function. You're not going to be able to do it. So as a leader, you have to understand this. I don't care what resources you've been provided. I promise during an incident response, there's going to be a lot more resources than you think there is, but you got to prepare to be able to find more resources if you've not already been provided them. Because what's going to happen at hour 12 is someone's going to need to go home and go to sleep. At hour 16, someone's going to need to go to sleep and take a break. Otherwise, you're just going to continue to spin your wheels. Finally, really, honestly, this is the one that's most important. That's why I put it as number one, but it's also the one that is the most abstract, is failing to see the whole picture. Honestly, during incident response, all of these things are here because an incident response leader has not determined what do we want to get out of incident response and how do we get to that point. You will have things like people being sent off on wild use chases to go figure out how a specific piece of malware has done something. Not what they've done, but how. When I go in and I tell people that doesn't matter, they look at me aghast. What do you mean I don't need to know how this malware executed on this system? I don't need to. I don't need to know the exploit itself. I just need to know how they got into your systems and then what that piece of malware did. You have to understand from an incident response perspective what you're trying to get out of this engagement and how everything plays into each other during an incident response. You have to see it as a system and a process as opposed to a bunch of individuals working together to hunt something down. It's fundamentally different than threat hunting because of that. It's a very stressful situation with a time constraint. And so you have to be very focused and you have to be going forward always. Otherwise, you lose that momentum. So now that I've talked about what bad IR leadership is, and now that I've talked a lot about how poor IR leadership is run, let's talk about how should you actually run an incident. It's great that I can tell you what's bad, but unless I give you some sort of advice here, you're not getting any value out of this presentation. That's really what I want to provide. And mind you, not all incident response teams are like this first one. I'm going to give you examples of good IR teams. And if you are thinking about getting into the incident response community, try to find IR teams who operate with about 50% of what I'm advising here. It's going to make your life a lot better. Or alternatively, go see how bad incident response teams work, and you'll get lots of lessons that way too. So when you're doing incident response, you need to be this dog. Not only as an incident responder, not only as a leader, but as a team. You have to be able to say, hey, I'm in the middle of this giant fire, and say, okay, I am fine. I know what I'm doing. I know what needs to happen next. Life's going to be okay. This is the intrinsic aspect of incident response that every incident response team eventually gets to, but it's really important that you find a way to get to this point. Otherwise, you're just going to be stressed out and unfortunately not very useful. It's hard to get to that point, but for veterans who've had to deal with stressful situations because of whatever they've done in the past, you're more likely able to handle this than someone who's potentially may just come out of college and hasn't had to deal with these stressful situations. I've dealt with a lot of IT people who've never had an outage to deal with, come into an incident response team, and it takes them a couple incidents to get to this point. So always remember, be the dog in the middle of the fire saying this is fine. The first tip that I'm going to give is determining exactly, Joey, actually. Determining your scope and end goal is your first thing that you do as an incident responder. It's the first thing that I recommend for leadership whenever they're trying to figure out an incident response plan. Determine what you want to get out of your engagement. Does this mean you need to know every technical detail, or does this mean you just need to know how they got in, how they got persistence, and how and how you're going to fix things, and what systems are safe and what's not. Determine what level of the detail and deliverable you get out of incident response. Following that up is knowing when that ends. At a certain point in the incident response, there's going to be a time that you say, I think I know everything that's happened here. And the operative word there is going to be, I think. There's always going to be some sort of risk acceptance when you say, hey, I think I'm good here. Because you're never going to know, fully what happened during an incident and, if you've caught everything. There can always be something hiding somewhere out there. It's most likely not going to be there, but you have to know what the risk the business is willing to accept. And there has to be communication between the business and the incident response team before this happened. Otherwise, and I've seen this happen, is you will have teams who sit there for hours going, hey, I think we're done here. Well, did you check this? Did you do this? Can you prove that they're no longer in our systems? And you can't prove a negative. So you have to know what your scope and end goal is. The other part of this on the flip side from a mirror standpoint is knowing when to call for help. If you do not have the resources during and you're being expected to do the incident response, you're going to need to push for having outside help. And it's okay to say that. Incident response is a specialized skill set. If you are not a funded team that has the ability to prepared or does not have an incident response plan, you're not going to be able to do this. You're not going to be able to come in and do an incident response across an entire environment. It's just not something you're going to be effective at. So once again, the funds will probably be there when an incident happens and production is down. It's time and time again, I see this happen. So push for outsourcing it and don't feel like it's a failure on your part. Part of being a good leader is knowing when to call for help. The second thing to do is having proper communication strategies. This one's really good for lowering that OODA loop lengthening from stress here, is knowing how to communicate and in what way to communicate. Before you have an incident response, set up templates so that you can communicate with people. Know what needs to be included when you are doing communications, both from a written and a speaking standpoint. Do you need to do something like CAN, which is condition, actions, and needs? Or do you need to just set up your own where, hey, this is the results that I've got, this is what I'm doing next? Whatever it is, determine that beforehand. Secondly, on top of that, if you've got these templates set up, make sure that you've got a consistent time interval for every update. You cannot have people coming in every 15 minutes asking for updates unless you've determined a very specific way you're going to communicate during those 15 minutes. You're just going to interrupt work if you have to ask for updates every 15 minutes. Set a time interval and stick to it. On top of that, determine how you're going to communicate. I can't tell you how many times I've been in incidents where people are like, well, we use Slack and then we switched to Teams and then we decided to start doing phones and then we called everyone into the office because we weren't working well remotely. Determine how you're going to do this beforehand. Don't try to sit here and figure this out. Everything takes longer during a high stress situation. So determine, are you going to be talking internally in-band communications with your internal teams, knowing that the attackers might leak your chat logs, or are you going to set up a server before time that you're going to be able to jump into during an incident and start using that's out of band. I recommend that people do things, maybe not remotely, but at least on a computer, because you can get a record of truth out of it. Some legal teams really don't like that. Determine that beforehand. And then finally, limit the amount of hops. During the incident, when you're talking, do not pass things up 4 levels of a chain. Don't go through your manager who goes to the CISO, who goes to the CTO, who talks to the board. Please stop. You're going to lose a lot of detail. People are going to ask questions that are going to have to be passed down, and it's going to mess up your communication strategy. Recognize that the people on your incident response team are probably going to be the ones closest to the incident, and that either they or the next level up are going to need to be the ones who are communicating. If you have multiple chains of your communication, you're going to draw everything out to such a degree that nothing gets done. And any decision that needs to be made is going to take a long time because, once again, every person inside that OODA loop during an incident, their OODA loop internally takes longer. So just remember that. Reducing the OODA loop is the most important part of any incident response. Next one. This one, we've talked a little bit about it, but I'm going to set some other things here, and this is some practical advice. Managing your human resources is part of being an incident response leader. It's really imperative that you do this. You need to set up a shift if you are going to work 24 hours during an incident, which most teams want to do. I recommend 10 hours a shift. After 10 hours, a lot of people start dropping out. They just become less effective, like I said. Knowing that people who are working opposite of their regular sleep schedules are going to be less effective than during the day, it makes sense. It's easy to know this, but you need to make sure that that's prepared for. You can't be asking the people who are working overnight to do the same level of forensics or at least the same amount as the people who are working during the day shift, at least for not the first couple of days of the incident. It's really important that as people work during these shifts, that they're doing different things as well. They cannot just be sitting there looking at the same log type for 10 hours a day. This is one of the other things that leads to those places where people are spending 10 hours searching for how the malware did something. During stressful situations, people like to freeze up and tunnel vision into what they think is important. Not a good idea. Try to switch between things. Try to switch between logs or what you're doing from an incident response perspective. On top of that, reduce your outside stress as much as possible for your humans, the people who are working these incident response engagements. Pay for the meals. Please don't get pizza for every meal, which I have seen before. People really start to hate pizza after about 72 hours, I've noticed. Let people take breaks. Force people to go exercise. Get them out from being in front of the screen. Otherwise, you get that tunnel vision. You get those people being less useful than if they had come back fresh. You need that time to be creative during forensics if you can't figure something out. You have to give people those breaks. On top of that, allowing people to work in pairs is a natural obstacle to a lot of these bad things from communication and from a human resource standpoint. If you have another person to sit there and talk to and riff with and throw jokes at, it's going to make your life a lot better. It's going to make it so that you're able to stay awake a little bit easier, and it's going to reduce that OODA loop. Interestingly enough, if you've got two incident responders, they're going to be able to throw things at each other that they're going to be able to make a decision on quicker together than it's just one decision. And the reason is because you basically outsourced some of that stress to another person who's then going to basically make a decision there. Always remember that people in pairs during incident response are going to be better than a single person. And that includes for everything from both looking at logs to going out there and talking to people. You need to have people feel like they've been supported. And then finally, the last part of the human part of this is preparing beforehand. Understand that your OODA loop is going to lengthen in times of stress and doing things that you've never done before. If you try to throw in people to an incident response engagement before they have, without having done any preparation, you just say, hey, here's the plan, let's run it. They're not going to be effective even if you follow everything else in the steps. You have to have some sort of preparedness beforehand. Otherwise, it just doesn't work. People get very stressed out. They don't know what to do. The simplest things like getting access to a tool take forever. And I've seen this happen very often. People have invested a lot of money into their incident response plans, but they've never practiced it. It does not go well for them. Finally, don't forget tooling. Your IR tooling is going to function differently than day-to-day tooling is. Your EDR is not going to be used in the same way during an incident response as it would during the day-to-day process. With an EDR, I can go through on a computer and find a bad PowerShell script and what account ran that. But on that EDR, it's going to be a lot harder to go in and find how did that account get compromised if I've only found this bad PowerShell script on one of the machines that has had the ransomware ran. It's just a different way of looking at the tooling. It's going to still going to be effective, but understand that each tool has a purpose there, and you can't just make up certain things for each tool. You can't use your EDR to necessarily do incident response from a lateral movement perspective. It's a lot harder there. So know what tools you need to get your deliverables, and then also understand that your adversary has a say in tooling too. I've worked incidents where the adversary has gone in and locked people out of the tools that they would use to do incident response. So as your job as a leader is to know, hey, what do we do if this tool doesn't work, or we don't have the logs that we would expect from here because they've been deleted? What do we do to get around that? And it takes a lot of work to get there. And from an incident response perspective, you better have prepared and ran CTS beforehand to deal with these sorts of things. Otherwise, you're not going to know what to do. Let's talk about a new scenario then, after we've put all this stuff into place. And this is how I usually like to run incidents. This is how most incidents go when I'm part of a good incident response team. The on-call person's phone goes off. I've ran a new incident. I'm being told there's a new incident. I get up. I jump onto my computer or drive into the office based on whatever I like. I am told the deliverables are XYZ, a timeline, how the root cause of how people got in, and then a new system, and then new systems being stood up so that people can get back to work. The shift starts the moment I get called in. I am giving hourly reports in a specific template, which is going to be results oriented. What did I do this time? What do I need to do next? What do we still need to know? I give those reports hourly. It's a specific cadence. I take about 15 minutes out of every hour, which is quite a bit, mind you, but I think communication is really important for when I run incidents and I get those reports back. They get passed up one level up the chain and then gets passed up another level up the chain. And then these usually go for about 3 to 4 days. Our internal, when I've worked incidents internally, our SLA is a lot of times for a forensic standpoint is 3 to 4 days. And that's six to 8 shifts, but generally I'm not having to figure out, okay, what do I do in this situation? What tool can I use to do this? I've got the access figured out within that first shift. That's usually my access shift. The person who's leading this incident is the one directing me to do different things during my incident response. And they're generally, what they're doing is they're telling, hey, we need this, we need this, we need this. It's not how do you do something, it's we need this. And then if I have a question, I can go back and ask them, and they have that generally prepared for them. Or they don't know about it. They tell me to go back to what I was doing, and then I'm going to basically go ask them whenever I need to get to that point from an incident response standpoint for a deliverable. And they're going to tell me, okay, this is how I've decided that you do this. You're offloading that stress, and you're offloading the OODA loop lengthening. Some final thoughts here, and then we'll get to questions. Incident response is a marathon, not a sprint, as Joey said in there. It's very true. You cannot expect it to be a sprint. Know that your attackers do have agencies during your incident response. They are going to try to make your life as hard as possible. Your disaster recovery plan is not going to be adequate. Failing at incident response is almost always a leadership failure, not a technical one. This is a very basic concept of accountability, but you have to know that the technical aspect of not being able to just figure out something from a forensic standpoint is not usually going to be because you can't see it technically. It's going to be because you don't know what you're doing leadership-wise. You haven't had that direction. And then finally, the best incident response is worse than the worst security control. I have gone through, from an incident response standpoint, I have gone into companies that have these really massive incident response plans. They spend a lot of money. They have an onboarded incident response team, and their SOC team is like 3 people, and their engineer team is like 2 people, and they have like a whole incident response team. And I'm just saying, you could take half the budget you spent on your incident response team, put it into your SOC or your engineering team, and you probably wouldn't be in this situation. It's one of the hard parts about being an incident responder is that your job is based on the attacker succeeding a lot of times. But I never want the attackers to ever succeed. So please invest into your security controls instead of your incident response team. That incident response team is something you should do after you said, okay, we're at a baseline here. So thank you everyone for attending my talk. I'm 100% happy to answer questions now. I did have one in there from Jason, which was incident response plan or SOC playbook. Jason, could you talk a little bit about that? I want to make sure that I know the question specifically before I answer it. Sure. So when does the incident response stand down? How do you know an incident is over? Those are really good questions. What I will tell you on that is when you're doing incident response in any way, you have to have had these conversations beforehand, or you have to have some of the deliverables that's been agreed upon. You cannot sit there and say, hey, my incident is done when the attacker is no longer in the environment, and I can prove it. You're not going to be able to prove that negative. You're never going to be able to go so deeply into systems or logs to find something that's maybe there or maybe not, to be able to say, hey, I can say we're completely safe. You have to set a deliverable of, okay, I found the C2s, I found the persistent mechanisms, or at least I found most of them that can be reasonably found within this amount of time. I found how they got in, and that's usually fairly easy to find, is finding how they got in. Not easy to find, but it's something that you'll do as part of the incident response. And then you say, okay, this is the timeline. I can talk through the entire timeline of how they got through the entire attack kill chain. Now I'm done. You're still going to have some unanswered questions there. Just showing me things of, hey, is there a different persistence mechanism? But you're going to have to basically acknowledge that risk and say, okay, we've been able to change a lot of these things. We've been able to say that, we've changed how they got in. We've changed what they would normally do from persistence. We've removed any sort of persistence that we've seen. We've cut off their C2s, and we've rebuilt the environment with different credentials so that at least we're going to have some sort of warning if people start going through and doing credential access, that sort of thing. Thanks, Joey. Thank you, guys. I really appreciate it. This was a lot of fun. I am on Discord and on Hopin. If you have any other questions, I'm happy to answer them.